Hi, and welcome to another episode of Mixing Coach. So, today we're going to have story time. This is prompted by a little discussion that I woke up to this morning on Twitter, and it's kind of about mastering. Now, the discussion was kind of along the lines of someone said that I respect people who mix and people who master separately, but kind of felt that um, you should be able to do both so you can kind of understand what's going to happen to your mix when it goes to mastering. And this kind of made me laugh because it made me think of myself very early on in my career. Now, I've been doing this a long time now, and when I started, access to mastering was not what it is today. So there was no Ozone, there was no T-Rex, there was no whatever else people are using, and there wasn't even a L2 or something, a software limiter that people would throw on their mixes for home mastering. Nope. What happened was most things you did, especially demos or budget type releases that went out on cassette or something like that, or even the early days of CD, they didn't get mastered. That was reserved for people who had money and budgets and labels and so on. So all that would happen is you'd make a bunch of mixes, and then it would get compiled, and that would be then used as the master to go ahead and make the cassettes or whatever else had you. It wasn't until I got to the point where I started to do work for real record labels that I even got to enter that world. And prior to that, I'd assumed that, yeah, well, when my stuff gets mastered, that's going to transform what it is I'm doing from being, pretty good to being finally sounding like those records that I've been listening to my whole life and love. And, the whole reason I got into record making was being in love with music and records. And that was, something that I'm not quite able to do yet. So, what happened was I started to get good enough to the point where I started to get label work. And one of the first things I did with regards to label work is get hired to either produce or mix or both B-sides for artists who were putting out singles. And in those days, they would have put out multiple formats to get more sales of the single, which meant that it might have more than one version. It might have different B-sides, so the fans would buy each copy, or several remixes and so on and so on and so on. So I got to the point where I was getting hired to do B-sides, mix B-sides, which meant that my work was going to be mastered along with the single. So I would speak to the label manager and find out when and where it was going to be mastered, which at the time for me meant taking a trip into London and spending my day in London. So I would find out who and where and when it was getting mastered, and I would show up and say, "Hey, oh, I'm the guy who did the B-sides. Can I sit on the session and see what you did?" And generally, they were quite accommodating because, one day you might grow up to be somebody and, bring them work. So they would let you come and sit in, and you'd be, very well behaved with a cup of tea, your first cappuccino you've ever had in your life, that kind of thing, exotic, and be a good boy and sit in the corner and watch. Now, so I went to Soundmasters, which was a well-known London mastering suite run by a very famous guy called Kevin Metcalf. Now, you probably might not have heard of Kevin Metcalf, but he mastered a ton of classic records and was one of the kind of probably the best UK reggae mastering engineer, and he basically mastered anything that was ever great. And he also had a young man who he kept in a closet who grew up to be known as Streaky, who was his junior and was pretty much the guy, as far as I know, who kind of kicked off this online mastering trend. You know, he's keeping Streaky in the closet and, oh, Gov, can we do this thing? It's called online mastering. It could be big one day. So anyway, and now you, if you know and you watch YouTube, probably know Streaky. And anyway, Streaky is now his own entity and has been for like 20 years. So anyway, I go to the session and I'm sitting there and, you know, it's time for him to master my songs, and he does, and it takes about 10 minutes. And I'm sitting there, I'm trying to watch what he's doing. He's got this super expensive Maslech EQ. He's got these kind of like vintage compressors, and nothing's even really moving on the compressors. And then dum checks it a few times and it's done. And I'm like, oh, Kevin, so sorry, could I ask what you did? And he goes, oh yeah, I took out some 350 to clear up some mud, and then I added some top end to open it up. I'm like, oh, right. And what about the compressors? He goes, oh, just like half a dB on this one and half a dB on this one, and then it goes to my limiter to make it loud. And I was like, is that it? And at that point, I realized that mastering wasn't the thing which was going to truly transform my work and turn it from whatever level it was at the time into this amazing finished polished record thing. Oh no, that was all on me in the mix. And it sounded good, and it was the first time I'd actually heard my work next to kind of like an A-list mixer, so I now knew kind of what to aim for. But it didn't change what I delivered particularly. So this is a common misconception, I think, between people, especially now. They assume that, in the case of the conversation this morning, that they're going to somehow have to mix with mastering in mind. And ultimately, that's not what happens. Ultimately, the goal is for your mix to take care of all the things like translation. It should have the correct amount of bass. It should have the correct amount of top end. It should have the correct dynamic balance. Mastering is really only about providing that last step of quality assurance, and ideally should do very little else apart from bring the level up to whatever the commercial standard is of the day, which is a revelation as a young engineer, because it makes you realize you have to go back and work a lot harder to get your mixes up to the level of the people you respect and admire, or at least it did for me. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, what's the point of getting it mastered then? And there are benefits. Building a relationship with a mastering engineer separate to yourself could do lots of things. First of all, you can build a relationship with somebody who can maybe help you. So I always ask the people I work with, okay, so how was it? What was there? Was there anything weird? What did you have to do? And from that, I've even developed a game with one guy that I've been working with for many years. And my goal is for him to send me a message which tells me he's doing it flat, meaning applying no EQ whatsoever to the mix and mastering. And if I've done that, I know I've won, I've nailed it. Because that's ultimately my goal. My goal is to deliver mixes which need nothing doing to them. If your mix needs a ton of things doing to it during mastering and comes back drastically different than it did going into mastering, then basically your mix isn't very good. And that might be harsh, but that's how it is. There are a couple of caveats in the sense that when you're making an album, the mastering engineer really comes into their own, because they might have to take mixes from disparate sources, different times, different, all kinds of different factors, and then somehow, by using their taste make that sound like a solid, cohesive piece of work which flows track to track and so on. And that in itself is a skill and an art. Also, providing that extra stage of quality control. Maybe you are working in a room which is not fantastic, and maybe your low end is a bit wonky, and they can help you fix that. And other factors as well, like maybe you're slightly deaf, you don't you put too much top end on your mixes, and then they can go ahead and compensate for that as well. But realistically, ultimately, mastering should do as absolute little as possible. You're never going to mix thinking about the master. You're never going to be like, oh, I'm going to put my snare louder because it's going to be hit with a limiter and that's going to bring it down. Well, if that's happening, then you're using the wrong mastering person, because in the big bad world, they would have been clipping their A to Ds, which has a very different effect to a limiter. And it doesn't do that, which would mean you would end up with a snare which is too loud on your record. So essentially what I'm trying to say to you is you never think about something downstream. You're always thinking about delivering the absolute best possible you can at the mix stage. So there we go. A little bit of stuff about mastering. If you've got any questions about it, I'm more than happy to answer. I have sat in on I don't know how many mastering sessions throughout my career at all kinds of wonderful facilities with all kinds of wonderful engineers, study what they do and have a great respect for them. So we'll be happy to answer any questions, or if you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll speak to you soon. Take care.